Hi AP Biology students, welcome to your first set of notes. We are going to start the year with chapter 13, which is about natural selection and how populations evolve. Since this is the first time that you're seeing and listening to the notes, I would highly recommend that you have some way to take your own notes while I am talking. These slides are available to you on Schoology, or you can just use like notebook paper or something to jot some things down. I do not recommend just passively listening because even the act of just writing something down tends to trigger the brain to help you to remember it. So please follow along, take some kind of notes. We are going to do just the first half of the chapter 13 notes in this video, and at the conclusion you should go online to take the multiple choice quizzes just to double check that you picked up on some of the things that were mentioned during this video. So I'm going to get started here. So chapter 13 is all about how evolutions evolve. Kind of starting off, the definition of evolution is a change in gene frequencies over time. We'll get into what a gene is in just a second, but the idea is that evolution can be shown with data. On the picture here, there is some organisms here. They are representing, let's just say, bacteria. And these bacteria are identified with different colors, meaning that they have different genes and they have different DNA in them. And then if I were to spray, let's say, Lysol on the surface that these bacteria are on, the different DNA that they have might allow them to survive that Lysol spray. The container of Lysol says 99.9% effective. Well, that means 0.1% are going to be able to survive. It's something inside these organisms that allows them to survive. You can see that when the Lysol was sprayed then, only some of those survived, and only the red ones survived. Only those bacteria that had that special gene that allowed them to survive. Those bacteria then, since they're the only ones that are alive, they're the ones that can reproduce and have more offspring. Generally, our offspring tends to be pretty similar to us, so the end result in the final population is that all of those resulting bacteria have that gene that allows them to survive. With this simple example, I can see that there is a change in gene frequency over time. The percentage of red DNA that I had to begin with was lower at the beginning. At the end, my percentage of red DNA is 100%. So I changed from a small percentage of red to a very high percentage of red. That is the definition of evolution, a change in the gene frequency, a change in the DNA over time. We often think about evolution taking millions and millions of years to occur, and that is true in some cases. In other cases, like we'll see here in just a few weeks, we can show that evolution can occur in a really short period of time based on how quickly the organism reproduces. Something like bacteria reproduces super fast. I could see a change just like this really quite fast in a population of bacteria. So let's kind of get into what we've got coming. Next, definition of a gene. A gene is a word you guys have all heard of many, many times, so I'm pretty confident you're kind of familiar with what that is. A gene is a piece of DNA that codes for a trait. On this slide, I've got a bunch of snails. They're all beautifully different colors. It's their DNA, it's their genes that allows the snails to look a certain way. An allele is a variation of a piece of DNA. So in my snail example, some of my snails have an allele that codes for brown. Some of them have an allele that codes for yellow. Some of them have an allele that codes for more of a striped pattern or more of an orange pattern. Regardless of the color that I see, those alleles are all the same gene. The gene is coding for the color of the shell. When we think about evolution and changes occurring over time, We're talking about species and populations. Me, in my life, I have not evolved based on the biological definition of evolution. I was born as a tiny baby, I was a toddler, I was an adolescent, I was a teenager, now I'm an adult. That is not evolution. I have not had a change in my DNA frequencies over time. So if I want to study evolution, I've got to look at multiple organisms, generally over a period of time. So we've got two definitions here. Species, those are organisms that can breed and produce fertile offspring. What that means is that if I wanted to consider myself the same species as another organism, we would be able to have a baby, and that baby would have to be able to also have babies. So something like a mule. A mule is a donkey bred with a horse. And when you cross a donkey and you cross it with a horse, you get a little baby mule. Interestingly, though, mules cannot ever have babies. The only way to get a mule is to cross a donkey with a horse. So by this definition of species, a mule would not be considered a species because mules are all sterile. There's some kind of weird exceptions that we'll kind of get into in the future about what is a species, and that's coming actually not for another 2 weeks. But for now, the definition of our species is organisms that can breed and have babies who can also have babies. Definition of a population, they're organisms of the same species that are all living together. They're all together in the same place at the same time. So I would consider if these snails are living here in this lake, they are then a population residing in this lake. You can see there is a land bridge here and an entirely separate lake over here. I might have some snails that are living in that lake, and they would be considered a different population. They're not in the same lake at the same time. However, if I picked up a snail from one of the lakes, mixed it with a snail of the other lake, they had nice little snail babies who could have little snail babies, I would say those are still the same species. But in order to be called a population, they've got to be in the same place at the same time. Evolution is considered to be a theory, a scientific theory with a big T. The way that we use theory in our everyday language isn't really accurate based on the scientific definition of a theory. So in science, we use the word theory to be something that is supported repeatedly by data. Meaning, no matter what type of science I'm doing, no matter what type of evidence I'm looking at, there has never been scientific proof, scientific evidence that evolution does not occur. So it's an idea that's continually supported by data. As more discoveries are made, such as like the discovery of DNA, which happened in the early 1900s, mid-1900s, those still support the idea of evolution. We've never found any scientific proof that evolution does not occur. Here on the slide, there's a few other examples of scientific theory. So again, these also have not ever had any scientific proof found that disproves them. So like the top one is the cell theory. That essentially says that all living things are made up of cells. Never in the history of science have we ever found a living thing that is not made up of cells. Big Bang theory is the idea that the entire universe expanded from one central point and is continually still expanding. Astronomers, physicists always find data that supports that. Atomic theory means that all matter is made up of atoms, so we do continually see proof of that. Theory of gravity, if you drop something, it's going to head toward a giant mass, which is the center of the earth. So all science, all aspects of science have continually found evidence that support these theories. I do not think that you need to memorize all those. They are just examples of other types of theories. All right, getting a little bit more into what is evolution. We've got this guy, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Never in this class will you be expected to memorize people's names. Never will you be expected to memorize dates. This is just kind of to give you a ballpark, lay the groundwork of what evolution is. So Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, he published his paper in 1809. Keep in mind, in terms of science, in terms of technology, 1800s is like a really long time ago, right? They didn't know what DNA was. They didn't have good ways to look at cells or to analyze what was inside of cells. So this was, in terms of science, just a really long time ago. But he did have some good ideas. Some of his ideas we've since discarded, and we've found evidence that his ideas actually are no longer believed to be true. And like anything in science, that could happen at any point. People used to think the world was flat, and they thought that if they sailed their boat to the horizon, they would fall right over the edge. And that made perfect sense to them at the point. Until, at some point, they got in their boat, and they realized they could keep sailing, and in fact, the horizon was not the edge of the world. So at any point, we might discover something in science that actually reverses or negates or proves that what we thought before actually isn't true. So at his point, 1809, he did see that life changes from simple to complex over time. That's an idea that we still know is true today. We look in the fossil record, we see organisms that don't quite look exactly the same as they do today. He came up with two main ideas. One of them is use and disuse. This idea has now been proven to be not true. But it kind of acts as a good way to clear up any misconceptions or any confusion you might have. So his idea of use and disuse is essentially that if you use a body part, it will get bigger or it will get stronger, and then that bigger, stronger body part would get passed on to your offspring. So he felt that when he looked at giraffes, he believed that long ago giraffes had a short neck, which is true. They did. We can see that in the fossil record. So Lamarck would have said, well, when these short-necked giraffes were alive, they needed to get food that was a little bit higher up on the tree. So they would stretch their neck and elongate those muscles by stretching. And since they needed that neck in order to survive, they would then have a baby who had a little bit of a longer neck. And that baby still needed to reach up and stretch to get higher and higher food, so it would have a baby that had a longer neck. And eventually we reached the long-necked giraffes that we are familiar with today. Actually, in reality, this is not true. Just because you need something, even if you need it to survive, it doesn't mean that you're going to get it and then have a baby that has that same trait. If I'm on the top of a building and it starts burning and it's lit on fire and I need to get out of there, I am not looking like I'm in a good situation, right? I might die in this burning building, and I might think, oh my gosh, I need wings to fly out of here. And no matter how badly I need those wings to fly out of there, I'm not just going to get them. So evolution is not based on what an organism needs to survive. It's a little bit due to chance. This giraffe who had a short neck, maybe there were a few giraffes in the population who had necks that were even just a few inches longer and a few inches shorter. Well, those shorter necked giraffes, they all died. They're starving. They're not going to have any more babies. So that short neck gene is going to be diminished and removed from the population. Those giraffes that had a neck that was even just a few inches longer, they survived. And they could have babies that had those same length of necks and probably a little bit of variation in there too. A couple inches bigger, a couple inches smaller. Well, with each generation, it was always the giraffes with a little bit longer necks who could survive and have babies. So that's why over a huge period of time, we saw this change in neck length. Another facet of this use and disuse idea is that if your body part isn't used, then it's just going to deteriorate or diminish or disappear over time. This fish here, he lives in a cave, and that cave is pitch black. I'm talking no speck of light. So in that cave, having an eye is just simply useless. There's nothing to see at all. So Lamarck would have said, well, these fish, they don't need eyes. So over time, their eyes got smaller and smaller, and then eventually they just had no eyes. In true evolution, we would explain that, well, there was no disadvantage to not having an eye. So the fish that had no eyes, they didn't die. They could have babies too. And so over time, there became more and more babies that had no eyes, simply because it was perfectly fine to not have an eye. So why then today do we see that in this cave, these fish don't have eyes? Well, maybe the eye ended up having some kind of cost to the fish, like it got infected, or it took a lot of energy to grow that eye. So it ended up being perfectly fine and actually pretty good to not have an eye. So it's not that the eye gradually got smaller and smaller and disappeared. The same could be said true about a human's appendix. They say an appendix, you don't really need it. Appendices tend to be in organisms that digest really woody plants like bark or sticks, and humans really haven't eaten those for many generations. So based on Lamarck, it would say that every year, or rather every generation, every time we have babies as a species, the appendix is getting smaller and smaller. Well, that's actually not true because we still have an appendix. So Lamarck's idea here, use and disuse, not such a good one. Lamarck also said that changes that occur during your life would get passed on to your baby. This one I think is a little more obvious that it's not true. If I dye my hair purple, my baby's not going to have purple hair. If I get in a tragic car accident and lose my leg, my baby would still be born with 2 legs because it's in the DNA that the baby's inheriting. This here shows the idea that lizards lost their legs and then could have a baby that had no legs. And oh, look, it's like a snake. That's not actually true. If I were to capture a lizard and cruelly cut off all of its legs, it would still have a baby with legs because the DNA inside that lizard codes for legs. Jersey Shore, terrible show. Hope you've never seen it. But the idea here is you work out a lot, you're going to have a strong baby, this poor kid. No, that's not going to happen. Things that you do during your life, to some extent, will not affect what your offspring looks like. Which brings us to Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin is like the head honcho of biology. I feel like most of you probably couldn't name a lot of biologists. I probably can't name more than just a bunch. But everybody knows who Charles Darwin is, right? He's like the babe of biology. Everybody knows him. So Charles Darwin piggybacked off of Lamarck's ideas. He came after Lamarck. And Charles Darwin is credited with this idea of natural selection. This is like a big kahuna, a big moneymaker, natural selection. Very important topic to know. Natural selection is the idea which we still believe true based on all evidence that we find and have found since the mid-1800s. Evolution does hold true in all scenarios, and that's organisms with certain traits produce the most offspring. Here I've got 2 rabbits, one of them very camouflaged. If there's an animal out hunting like a fox, this bunny probably has a pretty good chance of surviving. He's camouflaged, he's not going to be seen as well. Since he's going to survive, he's going to have a lot of babies. Guess what? Those babies will get the DNA to also have white fur. This rabbit here on the left, he is not camouflaged. A fox out hunting is going to see him. He's probably going to die. If he's dead, he will have no babies. That brown fur allele will not get passed on. Darwin gets a lot of credit because he didn't just have this good idea, he had a lot of evidence. He went on a sailing trip around the world and he collected all kinds of evidence and published it. And so he didn't just throw out an idea. He had evidence and examples that backed it up. There are a few facts that go with natural selection that you'll be expected to know. So fact 1 is that all species reproduce exponentially, meaning they have way more babies than could ever survive. Hopefully, you've seen one of my favorite movies, Finding Nemo, but I feel like Finding Nemo pretty much perfectly exemplifies this. Nemo's dad and Nemo's mom had a ton of babies at the beginning of the movie. They laid all those eggs. They were watching those eggs. Along comes a predator, and there's so many more babies than will ever survive. The predator eats a lot of the babies, and only one little baby survives. So this is exponential reproduction. There's, in almost all cases in nature, more organisms than ever have a chance to survive. Lots of babies, not many survive. This picture here shows a sea sponge. All that white stuff coming out of it is sperm. There is no way that all of that sperm is going to get fertilized, or that all of that sperm will fertilize an egg. And hence, again, we have that idea of exponential reproduction. Make a lot of sperm. Hopefully, some of them will find an egg to fertilize. And then hopefully, some of those eggs will be able to survive and eventually have their own offspring. Fact number 2 is that populations are normally stable in size. That means populations tend to stay the same size. Even though we have all of these babies being born, we don't see that the population is continually getting bigger and bigger and bigger and multiplying out of control. Rather, we see something that looks more like this. Population is stable and not changing too much over time. Yeah, it goes up and down a little bit, but it tends to kind of stay around that same amount. The reason for that is fact number 3, which is that natural resources are limited. There's simply not enough food, not enough space, not enough water for every single offspring to survive. There also might be things in the environment that cause organisms to die. We call those things a selective agent. Examples might be like a disease, a predator, something that keeps the population from growing too much. Also with natural selection, we see that no two individuals in a population are exactly alike. To remind you, the reason these different organisms look different is due to their DNA. So why will some survive? Why will some die? It's due to what they look like, but that is due to their DNA. Variation is inherited, meaning you get your DNA from your parents. So to kind of recap, natural selection, organisms that are best suited to the environment survive. It's not totally random who gets to survive. Do the brown bunnies survive? Do the white bunnies survive? Well, it depends on the environment. Favorable traits accumulate over time. Those organisms that have good DNA are going to be the ones who survive and who have babies. Those organisms with bad DNA, they're going to die, probably before they ever have a chance to have babies and pass on that bad DNA. So over time, that bad DNA will be lost from the population. And then finally, and extremely importantly, is that natural selection favors a trait for the environment that the organism is living in. It is not always the strongest organism that survives or the biggest organism that survives. It depends on what's going on in that environment. Good example of this is polar bears. You guys are very aware of global climate change and the idea that just overall our environment, our climate is changing. Historically, if we were to look back hundreds of years or even thousands of years or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, If you were a polar bear living in the Antarctic, it would be good to be a big, strong polar bear who could kill big prey and could kill your competitive other polar bears. In a fight for mates, in a fight for survival, it is good to be a big, strong polar bear. Now, with global warming and the ice caps melting, those big, strong polar bears are actually becoming less and less favorable simply because there's not enough ice to hold those big, huge polar bears. So in even the past few generations of polar bears, scientists have identified that polar bears are actually decreasing in size because the biggest, strongest ones can't find an ice block to stand on. So they're drowning, they're dying. So while it used to be good to be big and strong, now it's actually not really that favorable. So it depends on the environment that an organism is in. A similar example are these peppered moths shown here. Long ago, before the 1900s, there was data collected in a forest outside of England, and that data was about these organisms called peppered moths. And before the 1900s, those moths lived in a forest with birch trees. Birch trees have like a white bark. So when scientists counted how many peppered moths there were in this forest, they noticed that the majority of the moths were white in color. There really were not that many moths that were dark in color, simply because it would be bad to be a dark moth on a light tree. Predators, aka birds, would be able to see you and eat you, so you would stop having babies because you're dead. So it was always the white moths who survived. White moths had babies who were also white. But then in the 1900s in England, there was a huge boom of factories. And these factories put out a lot of soot and a lot of pollution. They didn't really have laws about that back then. So those white trees got totally covered in black soot, which is shown here. When scientists went back a few years after the Industrial Revolution began, they noticed that actually now the majority of the moths were dark. And it was the dark moths who survived and the dark moths who had babies. The light moths tended to die because they were easily seen. So this example just shows you that it is the environment that helps to dictate which organisms survive. It's not always just going to be this color survives or this size survives. As the environment changes, what is favorable also would change. I kind of already mentioned the giraffe example, so I'm just going to quickly hit this bird example before I move on. There's an ongoing study of birds off the coast of South America, and essentially as there's wet versus dry seasons, the size of the bird beak tends to change. When it's very rainy on these islands, there's a lot of fruit and a lot of soft food. And so all different size beaked birds can survive because all these birds can eat soft fruit like berries. But if there's a year where it's extremely dry and there's a drought and there's not those soft foods, scientists see that the birds with the biggest beak, who can crack open nuts or seeds or harder food, they tend to greatly increase in numbers because they can eat. And the small-beaked birds tend to die in those drought years. And so there has been like 50 years or 40 years of data collected about how these bird beaks change over the years based on the environment. So again, the idea that environment helps to dictate what is good. All right, couple more slides here. We hit natural selection. Nature determines who survives. Artificial selection is the idea that humans determine the best traits and humans are picking who survives. If we had a wild crop of tomatoes a couple hundred years ago, tomatoes would be all different in size, shape, color. Some would probably look really saggy and droopy. They'd be wrinkly. They'd have dots all over them. But over the years, people have said, well, we want to sell big, plump, juicy, red tomatoes. And so if I have a particular plant that looks sad and droopy, I would never collect the seeds from that and plant it. So I am choosing what is my good trait, plump, red, juicy, and I'm going to breed those organisms. This here is a beef cow. Cows today look much different than they did a couple hundred years ago because people are choosing to breed the biggest, stockiest organisms. I went to a festival when I was in Costa Rica and they were selling bull sperm there. And all these vendors had their biggest bulls out for display to show that that quality of sperm was so good. And the bigger the cow, the bigger the bull, the more expensive the sperm was. People are choosing what is a favorable trait and then breeding those types of organisms. To conclude here, there's a whole lot of evidence that supports evolution. As I mentioned earlier, no scientist has ever found scientific evidence that disproves evolution. Here we have the idea of a common ancestor. We're going to hit this more in chapter 15 in about 4 weeks. But the idea of a common ancestor is that organisms evolve to look differently, but it's likely that they stemmed from some relative long ago. So a common ancestor is an organism that eventually evolved into different species. Here on the left, we've got an elephant. Here on the right, a woolly mammoth. They have a whole lot of similarities. They are totally different species. If I put those two together now, they have actually found woolly mammoth sperm. So if we were to put those two together now, they would not be able to breed and produce. But they look pretty darn similar. And that's due to the fact that probably a long, long time ago, they were the same organism and then they split. So maybe here is a common ancestor that split into different organisms and they are then related. Fossils, kind of self-explanatory. Fossils are imprints found in rock, or they could be complete bones, complete organisms. But the way that we accumulate fossils is by layers of rock stacking on top of each other. So the wind or the rain carries little tiny particles of dust and dirt, and it gets layered over time. So my youngest rocks are at the bottom, and then wind comes, rain comes, and deposits layers on top. And I can see that striping, that stratification in this picture, showing that there are layers and layers of rock. And as I dig deeper in the rock layer, I see from farther in the past. Fossils are great when looking at evidence for evolution, but finding fossils is pretty hard. It's not like you're necessarily going to be just going out for a fossil dig and then suddenly find something. The chance of finding a fossil is pretty rare. Also, a lot of things are missing from the fossil record because soft organisms, like if you think of like a jellyfish, that's not really going to get preserved in a rock. Also, rocks and fossils are somewhat subjective, so I might look at this and say, oh yeah, I can see this, and you might look at that and say, no, I don't think so. I see something totally different. So not really a whole lot that you need to know about fossils because you kind of know what fossils are, but just the idea that it's one type of evidence, but there's also a whole lot more. Another example of evidence is biogeography. Long ago, all the continents are believed to have been attached into one giant supercontinent. And so geography means like location, bio means living. We see the same fossils, the same types of organisms in totally different parts of the world. So it's believed that these organisms that now live in Africa might be similar might be related to organisms that live in South America, simply because those continents were once connected. Also, when I study embryos, when we look at embryos, we can see similarities in organisms that are not quite born yet. At one point, you had a nice tail, you had some gill slits here, your eyes were on the complete side of your head, and we see those similarities when we study different organisms. When a human is actually born, they might not look quite like their embryo. So there's changes that occur during the unborn stage, but it allows these organisms to resemble each other before they're born. So why resemble each other if you're not really somewhat related? Homologous structure, homo, means the same. So a homologous structure, those are body parts that look pretty much identical. And they look identical because of ancestors that lived long ago. Today, they might be used for different things. So like in my human, my arm bone here at the top resembles the same exact bone that I see in these very different organisms. They serve different functions, but the layout of the bone patterning is similar. 2 more to go. Vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are structures that are no longer used today. And I mentioned like the appendix in humans earlier, that would be considered a vestigial structure. This is your appendix here attached to your large intestine. But that appendix really doesn't serve a function today. Maybe many generations ago it did serve a function, so it's kind of like a peek into the past. We see on a manatee is an organism that lives in the water, and it has toenails, which is shown in this picture, which is kind of weird because it's certainly far from a predator and it doesn't really have a lot of predators itself. It's just kind of floats around and eats vegetation. So those toenails are considered to be vestigial structures. Maybe long ago the manatee's ancestor lived on land and had to use claws for some kind of purpose. Here we've got an ostrich, an emu, a penguin. Those organisms do not really use their wings for much today, but maybe long ago their ancestors needed to fly, so they still have those vestigial wings. And then this shows like a hind leg in an ancestral whale. So what's the point of having these toes, these digits, if they didn't at one point serve some purpose? So a vestigial structure is something that we still have today that is no longer used. And then to conclude, molecular biology is the idea that we can use DNA, we can use proteins, we can use things inside of our teeny tiny cells that can provide evidence that we are related. Organisms that have more similar DNA tend to be more closely related. That's a statement that should make perfect sense to you. If I compared my DNA with your DNA, we would show more differences than if I compared your DNA with your mom's DNA. You and your mom are genetically more similar than me and you. Makes sense. You and your mom are more related. If I were to compare your DNA with a monkey's DNA, it would not be identical, but it would be more similar than if I compared you and a frog. So if I look at DNA or I look at proteins, I look at tiny things inside the cell, I see that the more related two organisms are, the more DNA they share in common. That's the conclusion of the first part of Chapter 13 notes. Hopefully you followed along and took some notes on your own and are ready to take the quizzes.